Hello and welcome to a special edition of Frontline, today coming from the Tank Museum in Bovington. I'm joined today by David Willey, who is of course a tank expert who's done a lot of work here. David, what do you make of the exhibition of equipment that's been to Ukraine here today?
Well, for the overall exhibition, the aim is, yes, it's great for people who like the kit to show that off. The real aim of the exhibition is this museum, we get 250,000 people a year, mainly families, enthusiasts like ourselves, find soldiers, etc. But the real thing for us is to get that story of what's going on in Ukraine across to our normal visitor. And already I've just met a young lady in tears for all the right reasons, because the emotion of recognising families, what they went through, the training that's gone on here with the soldiers in Britain, what they felt when they've been training the Ukrainians, all of those elements coming together to hopefully keep this story in the public eye, because obviously we've got distractions all over the place, what's going on in the world at the moment, but underneath it all, I think most of us would probably agree a very significant event is a war in Europe, and watch it because it could be coming our way.
And we talk about the human element of this exhibition, of course. I mean, the Tank Museum is not only a museum, it does also have has also had Ukrainians here who have then gone on to fight with these very vehicles. I mean, how important is that European support in training some of these soldiers?
So early days when I was here, and we'd get with Operation Orbital the Ukrainians who were training on armour, we would take them round. Some of it was, could we learn from them to also pass on, as well as us trying to explain some of the issues behind armoured warfare that seem to come back time and time again. How armour's been adapted over time, which of course is really, really important that way. But Bovington as a training centre is obviously somewhere that, we're very good at training in the UK. We might not have much way in the left of forces, but that sense of we're going to have to be doing this again. What are the things that the British Army could learn from the Ukrainians? How have we been able to compress some of those courses? What are the things that we really don't want to ever skimp on in terms of training, etc.? And of course, from the Ukrainians, they're using kit like the Challenger 2 in action. What is it that we can benefit in this new world with the drone, with top attack, etc.? How can we do all of that in a way that we can learn to make sure our own troops in the future that may well have to be doing this, we can actually have learned from the Ukrainians as well as them learning from us?
Yeah, and on that, I mean, I note that a lot of the equipment that we have seen here, some of which has come from Ukraine, it's not the big stuff, it's the smaller stuff, it's the drones, it's the new weapons that we've seen coming back from Ukraine. I mean, how much is there for Britain and the West and NATO to learn from the Ukrainians?
So one of them is that we've still got, in many areas, too much of a peacetime procurement economy going on, that we've got all the time in the world we can go off and we can do our procurement system. The Ukrainians have had to realise that it changes week to week, month to month. Weapon systems have to adapt consistently to the latest in what's going on the battlefield. And that's something that, again, that it seems vitally important that we in the UK find ways that we can speed up our procurement and the way we're going to deal with some of these problems in the future, rather than, because in many ways we're still probably teaching soldiers to do things that are no longer sustainable on the battlefield, with the advent of so many drones, etc. We can't do replenishments in the open or in ways that we used to. So lots of those ways that we're going to have to address things, and how we get the kit to address those things has just got to change, because otherwise we're going to miss the boat all the time.
And it really is crucial. I mean, quite notably, the bigger equipment here, the armoured vehicles that are here, I'm looking around today, and the vast majority, bar I think one behind me there, are European. So it really is Europe that's got to get its procurement, as you say, in order here, because of the important role they have played in supplying equipment to Ukraine.
And if we're going to have to replace some of the American equipment that was being promised or could have been there, I think the other thing is Europe's got to understand its own potential, and whether that's with the science, with the industries, with the potential of their own militaries and their own wealth, we've got ourselves on the back foot all the time as if nothing can be done without the Americans. It may well have to be done without the Americans. Everybody would want the Americans there. We know the American military are gutted with what's going on at the moment, but how do we address this in Europe? If we're going to have to go down that route, let's start genuinely getting our act together. Britain can't do everything on its own. Most European countries can't do everything on its own. So how are we going to cut up that cake? Where are those industries? How are we going to deal with this in the future? That's one of the things it would be. I know there's things going on behind closed doors. We need to see a bit more of that word tempo. We need to be doing this quicker.
Yeah. And I also note, I mean, conveniently, this room is kind of split almost into two sides. We can see some of the Russian equipment on the other side there, and the European and American equipment here. I mean, how would you, for a lot of people who come here, they might not notice a lot of the differences. Fortunately, we're in a room surrounded by people who are experts on this like yourself. How would you characterize the difference in the equipment the Russians are fielding versus what Europe and the West have supplied to Ukraine?
Well, so often that equipment started off being, on both sides, residues from the Cold War. Yep. In the West, NATO countries, we tended to have a belief that our equipment, item for item, was always better than the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet bloc. So if you were playing top trumps, a challenger was always going to, on the game, defeat a T-72 or T-80. The issue about this is, of course, scale, how that old Soviet idea of the way of war, and how new weapon systems, sometimes very cheap, have now come across on the battlefield, and how do we adapt quickly enough? It's not that those old weapon systems aren't going to have any value anymore. You know, if you've got a really old tank, a T-54 with a 100mm gun, it's still a 100mm gun under a level of protection. It's still got a value on the battlefield. So I think in the West, we're going to have to learn that lesson of where do we go for the high tech? Where do we put money into numbers, where we are going to need numbers? And how are we going to try and find a force that is not just going to last a day or two very well, but it could last 6 months? And that's a completely different mindset, I think, to how so much of our thinking's been going on for perhaps since the end of the Cold War.
And I mean, the Ministry of Defense in Russia today especially will be thinking a lot about this as well. I mean, they've just drafted another 160,000 soldiers. They're going to be looking to procure a lot more equipment to equip them as well. How does their procurement system differ, would you say, in terms of what they're looking for, where the equipment's coming from? I mean, some of this might even, some of their newer equipment, if you can call it that, might even come from North Korea.
Yeah, so you've got to look at this idea as well that in many ways Putin's Russia is still a command economy in many areas. So that idea of being able to have continuity, to have people in jobs, you know, simple things from the communist era. You had a weapons expert who would see a weapons system through its service life. Over here, in the British Army, someone's in post 2 to 3 years maximum, and then they've got to learn it all again with the next guy that comes in. So what are things that we could learn and may have to do, because quite simply we don't have the money in the same way. And you know, if we've got to cut our cloth to what's available to us, so whether that means in some areas going for that high tech, some areas numbers, and also getting a much better, which is obviously why in the West we look enviously almost at that Russian procurement system, because they are so much more organized in getting value for money compared to what we get. Now, so where are the compromises going to have to be made in NATO and NATO countries? The idea of 3 companies doing a competition that goes over 2, 3, 4 years, etc., before finally decisions made. I think we've got to radically look at that and find better ways of doing things.
Well, while I've got you here, and we're talking about what the West and Ukraine gets versus what Russia gets, we have behind us here a Marder IFV, I believe this is.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about this piece of equipment?
Yeah, so again, a typical example there of a armoured personnel carrier that was being used, or in this case, infantry fighting vehicle as we call it, having some firepower with it, that was used for those battle groups of the Cold War, that feeling of the armour, the infantry would be able to keep up with that. Now the Marder was pretty much retired from service in the German military, but the fact they still had stocks of them to be able to give to the Ukrainians gave it a new lease of life. And one of those other things, of course, in the West, this idea that we go on to the next model, that Russian system of keeping things in service for that much longer that you could still draw on, it still has a utility. And there's another one of those areas where getting rid of, so the 432 has been in British Army service since way back in the 1960s. Actually, it's still in service. What are the other bits of kit that we might be saying to ourselves, why get rid of those? Because they may have utility on future battlefields, even if it's not in that immediate frontline, top tier against the enemy role. And that's where certainly vehicles like this are being used by the Ukrainians, and they're finding novel ways to add extra armor protection, extra weaponry, etc., to increase the lethality on that vehicle. I think that's something we're going to have to copy in the West, because building a brand new vehicle just takes so long. Maybe we should be doing some upgrades on our older ones.
Well, David Willey, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.